Yeah, he's a city trader. I guess kind of atypical in the sense that he's relatively young, high-flying, lacking in a bit of empathy on the surface, so sort of perfect for that position. As we go forward, we realise that actually maybe he's a victim as well. You know, he's somebody with a young family who sits in an advantageous position to be taken advantage of in the world of insider trading. No question, there's a link, and Marlowe, the writer, he's not trying to be subtle or clever about it, he's just showing you, you know, there is undoubtedly a link in terms of how, I mean, it's very different. Like, gambling addiction is not about greed, whereas insider trading, very much a big part of it is about greed and wealth accumulation. But the similarity is the sort of cycle of it. Once you're in it, it's quite difficult to get out of it, you know. And there's always that sense of more, whether that's linked, like in gambling addiction, to your own anxiety or being stuck in a shame cycle as part of being an addict, or whether it's the fact that you made 10 grand in a minute, why wouldn't you do that again? Let's do it again, I need more. So there's definitely similarities, they're not exactly the same. No, not really. I've always had a sense of that. You know, I was in invisible workforce for a long time. You know, I was a cleaner. I used to clean the university in North London, and then I went on to become a youth worker and a youth counsellor, and that was another underappreciated job. The money was constantly cut from by the government, which is still being cut from now. And you know, I did a combination of those jobs for much longer than I've been in show business. So I've always been aware of that, and similarly, gambling has always been prevalent. I've always lived in areas, born and raised in London, and I've always lived in areas where I've been like, why is there, you know, 1 greengrocers and 4 bookies on this short stretch of strip? You know, it's like, you can barely get groceries, but you can constantly bet. I remember thinking that was a problem 15 years ago. So it's always been there in the back of my mind. I just think with the onset of incredible technological advances, access to everything related to our problems socially as a whole is just so much quicker, so much easier, and it's difficult. It's a tricky one. I mean, it's a fascinating question in the Q&A there, which is what happens if there's a gambling ad in the middle of a drama that's probably quite anti-gambling? And that's a really interesting question, because number one, yes, if that happens, that's a bit controversial, but on a deeper level, where do we stand when the money that you get from a gambling company could be turned into something really positive? If I look at the football team I support, Crystal Palace, a lot of the community work that they do, you could probably trace some of the money to the fact that they've got, you know, a gambling company on their shirt. I'm sure it brings in millions, you know. So what happens when bad money becomes good money? You know, are you part of the problem, or are you doing, you know? I think it's an interesting question. It sounds really cynical and horrible to say that we're lucky with cleaning up in terms of timing, but in a sort of horrible way we are, because gambling's been at the forefront of British news outlets for a while now. I started feeling it was a problem about 3 or 4 years ago. I'm a huge football fan. I started noticing how many football teams were sponsored by betting companies. Then I started seeing footballers getting in trouble for gambling. And I thought, well, what do you expect? These guys must be wined and dined by gambling companies all the time, you know. And when they're not playing football, they're super bored. So I can see how gambling addiction can come about. It doesn't affect your physical health, so to speak, like directly, not enough to be, you know, drug tested or anything like that. So you could easily build a gambling. And that was the first time I really thought about gambling addiction becoming prevalent within popular culture via football. And since then, we've seen it pop up in the news in so many different ways. You know, this idea of in-playing and constant encouragement to do it, pop-up adverts on your phone, the terminals in the bookies is another recent one, and then even today when we're doing this interview, on the front page of the newspapers and right at the head in the headlines on television, these stories about children gambling. So it's obviously we've got a big problem, one of our many big problems in the UK. It's another one that we've got, and we all share it, and even if you don't have it, it affects you in some way, shape or form. So like I say, that's why I say it sounds really horrible to say lucky, but it's a strange twist of fate that the show's coming out in the midst of all of this. I think it's making a responsible point about it, and like I say, I don't think it's a big, clever, preachy point about it. I think it's just saying, hey, this is happening. And don't you think it's interesting that within that we have haves and have-nots, just like just like everywhere else? There's this huge discrepancy, but both are gambling, and both in a way, and both are you know, desperately reaching for this extra pound. Well, I don't know how much I'm allowed to say about that, but obviously Blake is a conduit in many ways, and his actions have huge and far-reaching consequences. So I think that's probably enough of a teaser.